Let's consider now the first proposition of morality that Kant gives us. And recall, what's he doing here? He's trying to elucidate the concept of morality. What exactly is morality? When we talk about morality, what are we talking about? What is that? He's trying to elucidate that with these three propositions. So the first proposition states that an action must be done from duty in order to have any moral worth, in order to be morally praiseworthy. From duty. I italicize the word from there because, as we're going to see, that makes all the difference. That is crucial. Now, to illustrate this, so Kant, I think, would recognize that this proposition, you just show this to the man on the street, so to speak, they're not going to know what it means. But Kant gives four examples. He kind of tells four different stories that are going to illustrate this proposition. And these four stories, these four examples that he gives us, those are supposed to be, oh yeah, obvious, yeah, intuitive. Anybody should see that, yeah, that's how it's working. That, yeah, Kant's telling those stories. Yeah, that's right. That's how it would go. And these four stories, these four examples, Kant would want to say, they all point toward this first proposition. They all support it. They all illustrate it. Yeah. And so by understanding these examples, we're going to understand what this first proposition is. So the four examples are, Kant doesn't give them names, but I'll give them names. The prudent merchant. So there's an example involving like a prudent merchant or a prudent shopkeeper. I can't remember exactly what Kant calls them. There's an example involving suicide. There's an example involving a person that Kant calls a friend to mankind. Okay. And there's an example of a guy who's got gout. We're going to look at the first three examples. They help elucidate this first proposition. The fourth example is unhelpful. It's hard to understand. And once you get all the pieces in place and understand it, it doesn't really add anything. There's no benefit really to be gained by going through it. So we're just going to ignore the fourth example, right? We're going to look at the first three. So the first example is this example of a prudent merchant. Keep in mind, this is supposed to be illustrating that first proposition of morality. An action must be done from duty in order to have any moral worth. Okay. The way all these examples work is Kant begins with some moral duty that we have, some moral obligation that we have. And in the case of the prudent merchant, the moral obligation is not to cheat your customers, right? It's immoral to cheat your customers, give them back less change than they should get or whatever, right? And so Kant tells this story about a prudent merchant. The relevant duty to this story is going to be not cheating your customers. Okay. He says, well, okay, imagine you have a merchant and some, I think he calls them inexperienced customers come into his store to buy some stuff. Kids. That's what he has in mind. Inexperienced customers, something like kids. Kids, people you could cheat. The merchant could, if he wanted, give the kids back incorrect change and then pocket, and make a little bit, take that money for himself or whatever, right? But so he could do that. So there are kids buying candy at this merchant's store or whatever. The merchant could, and the kids would be none the wiser. The merchant could give them less change than they should actually get. But he doesn't do that. The merchant doesn't do that. And so the merchant, it would seem, is performing his moral duty, right? His moral obligations. He's performing them. He's not cheating his customers. But that raises a certain puzzle. That's kind of puzzling if you stop to think about it. And the puzzle is that the prudent merchant, this guy who's just not cheating these kids, he's giving them the correct change. And right, I assume like 99% of cashiers or whoever would do this. They're not going to cheat kids, right? They're performing their moral duty, yet we wouldn't we wouldn't extol their virtues just for that. We wouldn't praise them. We wouldn't think of them as these moral saints or whatever. We wouldn't think that their action is morally praiseworthy. Yeah, you're not cheating your customers, so you're performing your duty, but that's not morally praiseworthy. You wouldn't exalt the strong moral character of the merchant just because he didn't cheat his customers. But why not? He's performing his moral duty after all, right? Why isn't that morally praiseworthy? It's a kind of puzzle. And we're going to see this puzzle crop up in the other examples too. This person's performing their moral duty, yet they are not morally praiseworthy. Their action has no moral worth. That's the way Kant will put it. Right? This action of not cheating kids, that doesn't have any moral worth. Well, why not? That's weird. What do you need to do to have moral worth? Kant thinks the first proposition of morality explains why this action doesn't have moral worth. The first proposition of morality resolves this puzzle. And what Kant does is he introduces a distinction between acting according to duty and acting from duty. And so what Kant wants to say is that this prudent merchant, this person who doesn't cheat kids, yeah, they're acting according to duty because their duty is not to cheat customers. And that's what they're doing. They're acting according to duty, but they're not acting from duty. They're not cheating. They're not refraining from cheating their customers because that's wrong, because it's their moral obligation not to. That would be acting from duty, right? Somebody who refrained from cheating customers because that's wrong, because it's my moral duty not to cheat my customers. If that was what was motivating them, that was the determining factor of their will, that would be someone acting from duty. But that's not what's going on in this case. The prudent merchant, Kant wants to say, is acting from self-interest. The prudent merchant has kind of calculated to himself, well, look, if I cheat these customers, I could very well get a reputation for being the kind of business person who cheats other people, or kids at the very least, right? And if you get that kind of reputation, people are not going to go to your business. They're not going to go to your store anymore. People don't like that. And so I'm not going to cheat these customers, not because it's wrong and that's what's motivating me, but because, that's not a good way to run a business. You can't run a business that way. And if I started doing that, my business would go under probably. And I'd be kind of outcast from society, right? Who cheats kids and whatever, right? And so it's out of kind of a self-interest that the prudent merchant refrains from cheating his customers. And Kant would want to say that when he says all this, when he gives this analysis, he doesn't mean to be critical of the merchant. He's not saying that the merchant is a bad guy. He's just egoistic. He's just self-interest. That's not the idea. Kant would want to say, no, that makes sense. Like, it's okay to be motivated by self-interest in this kind of way. There's nothing wrong with the merchant. The merchant's not a bad guy. He's just not morally praiseworthy, right? And that makes sense. He's not morally praiseworthy because he's not acting from duty. He's acting from self-interest. And it's okay, at least in certain circumstances, like this, it's okay to act from self-interest, but it does mean that you're not morally praiseworthy. And that's okay. Not everything that you do has to be morally praiseworthy. You're not morally blameworthy. That'd be another way of getting at the point, right? Kant's not saying that the prudent merchant is morally blameworthy. He's not saying he's a bad guy or anything like that. He's just saying, look, he's not morally praiseworthy. Why? Because he's not acting from duty. And that's fine. You don't always have to act from duty. But the first proposition helps explain this case, because the first proposition says that action has moral worth only if it's performed from duty, right? And the prudent merchant's action is not from duty. It's from a kind of self-interest. right? Or to put it in terms that Kant's going to prefer later on, it's from inclination, right? The shopkeeper wants to keep his shop opening. He wants to keep being a merchant. He wants to whatever, keep the business going. He has an inclination to be successful in business and so on and make more money and whatever. And that's really what he's acting from. And that's fine, not morally blameworthy, but it's just not morally praiseworthy, right? And so we can kind of see what he's building into this idea of acting from duty, right? We're starting to see what this first proposition is getting at. Second example involves suicide. The relevant duty is not to commit suicide. So Kant thinks it's contrary to the moral law to commit suicide. It's immoral to commit suicide, Kant would say. He doesn't argue for that here. He just kind of assumes it. In Kant's day, at least, I think this would have been a far more widespread assumption. I mean, I guess I don't really know. I don't know how widespread it is today, but I imagine there are more people today who would dispute that than there were in Kant's time. So, but in any event, he doesn't argue for it. He just assumes it, right? You have a moral duty not to commit suicide. He's going to argue for it later in section 2 of the groundwork, and we'll see that when we read it. But the relevant duty is not to commit suicide. Okay, fine. So just even if you think that's wrong, that it's not immoral to commit suicide, whatever, just ignore that for the time being. Just go along with Kant just to understand the example. Okay, fine. Relevant duty, it's immoral to commit suicide. I have a duty not to commit suicide. Okay. Well, what Kant notes, or this is kind of the idea that he's getting at, look, all of us are refraining from suicide right now. Yeah? Yet we aren't morally praiseworthy for that, right? Right now, I am performing my duty, at least this relevant moral duty. I have a moral duty not to commit suicide, and I'm performing that. I'm not committing suicide right now. I'm refraining from suicide. Yet no one would praise my moral character for that right now, right? There's nothing morally praiseworthy about what I'm doing right now. Same kind of thing as we saw with the prudent merchant example. And so there's a puzzle. Why not? I'm performing my duty after all. And again, Kant's going to say, well, the first proposition explains why. Because I am acting according to duty, not from duty. What Kant says is that, look, the vast majority of people have an inclination to go on living. People like living. People like going on living. I'm refraining from suicide right now because I like living, because I want to go on living. I don't want to die right now, right? I have an inclination to keep going on. And so while I'm acting according to duty, I'm not acting from duty. I'm acting from inclination. What's really motivating me is like, I like living. I want to go on living. That's what's motivating me. My inclination. I'm not refraining from suicide because suicide is wrong. I'm not refraining from suicide from duty. It's my duty not to commit suicide. That's not what I'm acting from. I'm acting from inclination. And likewise, as we saw in the prudent merchant case, Kant would want to say, it's not as though we're all morally blameworthy for refraining from, no, it doesn't, from acting from inclination. No, that's fine. It's okay. We're acting from inclination. That's fine. It just means that we're not morally praiseworthy for what we're doing. We're acting according to duty, but our actions aren't morally praiseworthy because they're not from duty. I'm not refraining from suicide because suicide is wrong. I'm refraining from suicide because I like living. Right? That's Kant's idea. And so the first proposition, again, explains this kind of puzzling fact. Yeah? There's a wrinkle to the story now that Kant introduces. So far, what we've seen is just more or less identical to what we saw in the prudent merchant case. Just a different example. Kant switches things up a bit. Now he says, well, imagine this. Right? Yeah, we have an inclination to keep living. Now, imagine this now, however. Let's take someone like one of us who wants to live, enjoys life, has an inclination to keep on living. But let's say things just go really poorly for them, right? Let's say all kinds of misfortunes, I'll put it in terms of me, right? Let's say all kinds of misfortunes befall me, and my life is no longer valuable to me. And my future only holds out the prospect for greater pain, right? I don't know. I come down with some horrible disease or malady, and all kinds of other misfortunes befall me. And what it just, right? Life takes as bad a turn as it could possibly take for me. And so the future just brings the prospect of more pain. And it's just, I'd rather not go on living, right? Because going on living just means more and more pain. Very unfortunate situation. Say that happens. It happens to people, you know? And so I no longer want to live. I've lost my inclination to keep on living. Let's say that happens to me. But yet I refrain from suicide. Let's say I don't commit suicide, even though I no longer have an inclination to keep on living, even though I have an inclination to die, right? I'd rather stop living because living is just pain. But nonetheless, I refrain from suicide. Kant would want to say, well, now, Jeff, you're not only acting according to duty, you're acting from duty. Why? Well, because in this case, the only thing that could be determining my will, the only reason that I'm refraining from suicide is because it's wrong. My inclinations would have me commit suicide, right? My inclinations are to stop living. But if I nonetheless refrain from suicide, Kant's idea is, well, look, why are you refraining? It's got to be because you know that it's wrong. You're refraining from suicide, even though you want to die, because suicide is wrong, because it's your duty not to commit suicide. And what Kant wants to say, and what the first proposition implies, is that now my action has moral worth. My refraining from suicide has moral worth. I'm morally praiseworthy for it, right? And you might, so the idea that he's getting at here, what he's really kind of highlighting is that there's something about this, the kind of struggle, persevering over these inclinations that would have you violate the moral law, that's really where moral worth lies. Somebody who perseveres over those kinds of inclinations. We really see moral worth in that struggle. And I think that makes a certain amount of intuitively, it makes a certain amount of sense, right? We praise people who kind of struggle against their wayward inclination. So, for example, somebody who's really struggled with drugs or alcohol or something like that, and they kind of get, and maybe their life was kind of going off the rails for a little bit, but they get it back on the rails, and they don't do drugs anymore, and so on. There's something morally praiseworthy about that. There's some kind of strength of character there. Even though, even though they're doing the same thing that somebody who's never had a problem with drugs is doing, right? Somebody who's never had a problem with drugs is not doing drugs. We don't think that they're morally praiseworthy for that, but someone who has had that problem, who's kind of persevered through it and overcome it, we do think there's something morally praiseworthy about that, right? And Kant would say that's what I'm getting at with this first proposition. It's because that kind of former drug addict had these wayward inclinations, has this strong inclination to engage in this kind of behavior, and they overcome it anyways, right? That's morally praiseworthy, right? That's what Kant's getting at, and we see that in this suicide example. All right. Right? So the person who's refraining from suicide, even though they'd rather stop living, morally praiseworthy. Third example. So the first two examples that we've looked at, you might think, yeah, okay. Seems to be something to them. Seems to be intuitive enough. Seems to make a certain amount of sense. I can kind of get on board with that, and I can see what he's trying to highlight. The third example that he gives, this friend to mankind example, this is by far the most controversial of the examples. Controversial in the sense that people think, yeah, I don't know if Kant gets that one right. I'm not so sure about that one. The other two, yeah, sure, fine. Yeah, it kind of seems right. Yeah, the prudent merchant, sure. But when it comes to this example, people have really kind of criticized Kant, or at least, people not sympathetic to Kant, saying this isn't right. This isn't how it works. So let's see what the example is. So the relevant duty in this case is helping out people when and where you can, right? You got extra time, you got a little extra money, extra resources, help out people. Kant thinks that's a moral duty. He doesn't argue for it again. He actually argues for this later. We'll see later in section 2 of the groundwork, which we'll read later. That's the relevant duty, helping out people when and where you can. And what Kant asks us to imagine is a friend to mankind. So that is somebody, so the kind of person he's thinking of here. Imagine you've got a friend who, every Saturday wakes up at 5 a.m., drives over to the grocery store, spends, $200 on groceries, takes them over to the soup kitchen and makes up soup for the kind of underprivileged people of the area. Yeah. And let's say your friend enjoys doing that, right? Your friend looks forward to it. Yeah, I'll get up at 5 a.m. on Saturday morning and spend all my money and spend my day, in a hot and stuffy kitchen or whatever and making soup and so on. And yeah, I'll do that. I want to do that. I enjoy doing that. I enjoy helping out. This is the friend of mankind, right? The person who enjoys doing this, looks forward to doing it, right? It's Thursday and they're not thinking about whatever, going to the bar on Friday. They're thinking about going to the soup kitchen on Saturday morning. Consider a person like that, right? That's your friend to mankind. That's the kind of person that Kant has in mind. The person who enjoys helping out other people and looks forward to it, who enjoys helping out people when and where they can. Now he asks us to imagine, okay, so you got that person in mind, but now let's say all kinds of bad things happen to this person. This person becomes clouded by sorrow, I think is what he says, or something like that. So all kinds of bad things happen. I don't know. Let's say the people at the soup kitchen are super nasty to her. And or whatever, and other bad things happen to her, and the rest of her life just goes very poorly, and all kinds of sorrows, and she begins to not like people as much, and she the people she's serving, whatever, she just doesn't like people in general. She becomes more of a misanthrope. She doesn't like these people in particular. Let's say they criticize her soup and she doesn't like that, or whatever. I don't know, whatever, right? She becomes clouded over by sorrow. But nonetheless, she shows up on Saturday morning. She no longer wants to. She's no longer inclined to. She doesn't like showing up on Saturday, but she does it. She's there, right? Let's say that change happens. And so, yes, she shows up, but she'd rather not. She'd rather not get up at 5 a.m., right? The alarm goes off at 5 a.m. and she just kind of rolls her eyes and, right? And then goes and spends all her hard-earned money and buys the food and goes and makes it, right? But she hates it all along, doesn't want to do it. We have these two cases then, right? In the one case, before the cloud of sorrows over there on the left, she enjoys going to go do this thing. And in the second case, this cloud of sorrow has warped her perspective and she no longer enjoys it. Well, both cases, this person's acting according to duty, right? Your duty is to help out others when and where you can. This person's doing that. They're showing up at the soup kitchen at 5 a.m. or whatever, right? They go to get the groceries at 5 a.m. They show up at 6 a.m. They're doing their moral duty. Here's where it gets a little, I don't know. Here's what Kant wants to say. The person over on the left is not acting from duty. The person over on the left likes doing this. They enjoy it. They get pleasure out of it. They have an inclination to do this. And so the person over on the left, they're acting from inclination. They're inclined to do this. And because they're acting from inclination, their action, well, doesn't have any more worth. The person over on the right, they don't want to do this. They're not inclined to do it. They'd rather not do it. They'd rather sleep in on Saturday. And so Kant thinks the only thing that could be determining that person on the right's will is duty. They're showing up at the soup kitchen because that's the right thing to do. They don't want to. They'd rather sleep in, but they show up because that's my duty. It's my moral obligation to help out people when and where I can. So here I am. I'm showing up. I don't want to. I don't want to be here. I don't like you people, but I'm here. That, according to the first proposition, is morally praiseworthy. So the friend of mankind, the person on the left, the person who's cheery, who enjoys showing up, who gets pleasure out of doing this, not morally praiseworthy. The person who doesn't want to do it, morally praiseworthy. That's Kant's view. This is particularly controversial because most people think that the person on the left, or most people, I don't know, some people in particular, Aristotelians, think that the person on the left, that's your paradigmatically moral person. The person over on the left is the person with full virtue. If you recall Aristotle, he wanted to say that one of the signs of having a virtue is that you take pleasure in doing the virtuous thing. So far from like detracting from the moral worth of the action or of the person, Aristotle would say the fact that this person takes pleasure in showing up and serving and helping out people, that's a sign that that person is really, truly, fully, say, just. Whereas the person on the right, they're still doing a good thing. That's still a just thing to do. But that's not ideal, Aristotle would say. That's not fully morally valuable. Hopefully, Aristotle might say, this person would do this over time, become habituated to it, and maybe they'd come to, take pleasure in it. Maybe they come to be more fully just. It's good that they're doing it, even though they don't like it. But it'd be even better if they liked it. Right? That would be the Aristotelian analysis. And Kant kind of flips that. Right? And so Aristotelians have criticized Kant on this score, thinking he gets this one wrong. And it's a sign of maybe kind of deeper problems with his view of morality. That's the friend of mankind example. So I think, but I trust at this point, we can see how it illustrates the first proposition, according to duty, not from duty. According to duty, from duty, right? And how one is morally praiseworthy and the other is not. So to kind of recap, we have this first proposition. An action must be done from duty, not merely according to duty, but from duty. You got to do the right thing because it's right, or avoid the wrong thing because it's wrong in order to have any moral worth. That's Kant's idea. Last thing I want to say is one thing that you might have picked out from these examples. It's a kind of implication of the first proposition. Actions done from inclination have no moral worth. That's not what morality is concerned with. Morality is not concerned with these actions done from inclination. That's not how morality works. So actions done from inclination, no moral worth. That's not the realm of morality. We're going to see this come back later. So I stress this implication. I put it in very big font because we're going to see this implication come back later in the second ground.